Salve. If you've watched this channel for any length of time, you probably noticed that a lot of my videos, especially recently, tend towards criticism of what has been broadly called the skeptic community. And one of my repeated criticisms is that you cannot build a sustainable ideology or movement or community centered on being opposed to things. At some point, you need to establish what you are for and not just what you are against. So, to prevent myself from being called a hypocrite, by only pointing out why I'm critical of the skeptic community or the progressives, I think it's time I laid out what I believe in. So since the late summer of 2016, a small but growing number of YouTubers, including myself, the Distributist, and Ben McLean, have coalesced around the label of Traditionalists. This community, I would say, largely consists of politically minded Christians and social conservatives who, I think, have felt left out of the broader conversation when it comes to the movement against the progressives. The fact is that the skeptic community is comprised almost entirely of atheists, and mostly of individuals who would broadly consider themselves liberals or libertarian. I think individuals such as myself wanted to be part of a community that would represent our interests and beliefs, as we sought like-minded people, and conversed, a makeshift community has formed, and we have adopted the label traditionalism. So what is traditionalism? I think I can break down the definition into 4 parts. Number 1, belief in moral objectivism or moral truths. Number 2, belief that society ought to be built upon moral truths. Number 3, belief that traditions and traditional institutions are the mechanism by which moral truths are imparted down through the generations. And number 4, the rejection of the idea that society can be built upon modern concepts. The 4th part of this definition is why I think traditionalism can be classified nowadays as an ideology, because if you look at history, the first 3 parts were concepts that were found in almost every society, and while of course history is filled with reformers and conservatives, it hasn't been until the past few centuries in the West that these concepts were actually questioned. So if we say lived in 13th century France, traditionalism as I have defined it would not be one of numerous competing ideologies, but the reality of how society functioned. It is because of this that there haven't been traditionalist philosophers per se until perhaps the rise of modernity. And then, with people like Julius Evola or Oswald Spengler, it was more or less just a criticism of the modern world. Traditionalism wasn't a set of ideas being argued for, but they were the lived experience of everyone in society, save for, until the 18th and early 19th century, a few radical academics. So to reiterate, traditionalism was not historically an ideology the same way liberalism or progressivism was. Until the Enlightenment, all societies essentially operated under these principles. But since modernity has replaced traditionalism as the basis for society, at least in the West, these principles need to again be argued for, and not just, as people like G.K. Chesterton did, defended. Okay, so the first part of my definition of traditionalism is a belief in moral objectivism or moral truths. This is the foundation of a traditionalist society. This idea needs to be accepted as true in order for traditionalism to work. So, traditionalists believe in moral objectivism as opposed to moral subjectivism. We believe that good and evil, right and wrong, are real concepts and not just a person's opinion. Now, what this belief establishes from the get-go is a rejection of scientific materialism. We hold that there are metaphysical questions that cannot be answered using the scientific method. Now, similar to certain classical liberals, such as the Founding Fathers and John Locke, we believe in a concept of natural law, from which we derive natural rights, that morality, what is good and evil, is a concept we can comprehend and learn. This leads us then to question where this morality comes from, and to put a long story short, it comes from God. In the same way that the United States Constitution requires authors, so too does natural law. Now, this is not the same thing as divine command, where right and wrong only exist because God said so. While we still believe that yes, morality and everything, in the end, ultimately comes from God, we believe that a natural law exists, separate from God, but that which he created. God did not tell Adam and Eve what the difference between right and wrong was, but that knowledge was learned separately when they ate the fruit from the tree of knowledge. So to summarize, traditionalism holds that morality is not relative, but a real and objective truth, and that in order for there to be a moral law, there has to be a moral law giver. And as a side note, we don't believe that morality is objective just so that traditionalism can make sense. I believe that belief in objective morality leads towards the logical conclusions that form traditionalist societies. So the second part of the definition is the belief that society ought to be built upon moral truths. This, I think, is the logical conclusion that comes from the idea that morality, that good and evil, are real and objective concepts. If the good is that which we ought to strive towards, emulate, and seek out, and evil is that which we should avoid and stay away from in our own lives, it logically makes sense that societies, being comprised of individuals who believe that good and evil exists, should follow the same reasoning. So, to use the most obvious example, killing innocent people is always wrong. This is a moral truth, and this is a moral truth because it comes from natural law, and it comes from natural law because that comes from God. If we as individuals hold that killing innocent people is always wrong and it's not just our opinion, our society ought to abide by this moral truth and enforce it by law, education, and custom. More fundamentally, traditionalism believes that the morals by which society abides are non-negotiable, on the basis that moral truth, being truth, doesn't change in the same way that biological truth doesn't change just because those truths inconvenience somebody. That means, under traditionalism, the institution of marriage and its definition, being a lifelong union between one man and one woman, will not change. Ever. Underlying a traditional society is the idea that these moral truths don't change, and therefore neither should society's belief about them. The idea of social progress away from what has been established as true is a complete anathema to traditionalism. Now, before I continue, I think I need to address the idea of exactly where these moral truths come from. I understand that the idea of natural law is fairly abstract, and that I think people want and need a concrete source of morality. Now, I think I can assume by now that those watching this can recognize that the traditionalist society I advocate for would be Christian. Now, yes, I believe that various cultures and religions have differing opinions about morality, but that does not mean that a moral objective truth doesn't exist. Disagreement about what the truth is does not necessitate that truth doesn't exist. Anyways, I believe that the moral law I want societies to abide by comes from Christian teaching, and being a Protestant, I believe that the sole source of that teaching is the Holy Bible, being the Word of God. But ultimately, we derive our moral code from Christianity. So to summarize part 2, recognition that morality is objective leads to the conclusion that society needs to follow that morality, and because of this, society establishes moral truths that ought to be unchanging. And finally that, in the West, we derived our moral truths from Christianity. The third part of my definition is belief that traditions and traditional institutions are the mechanism by which moral truths are imparted down through the generations. I think this part of the definition is probably the most easily observed, but most difficultly comprehended when it comes to a more abstract sense of what I mean by traditionalism. Essentially, the idea is that moral truths, the values in which our society believes in, need to be passed down to successive generations. That society is not just about the individual in the here and now, it is about ensuring that our children and their children will inherit the type of society that upholds the moral truths and values that we value and were taught ourselves by our parents. And I think that the way we do this is first and foremost through educating successive generations in the moral truths we believe in. This is self-evident, but it's something that recently has been attacked as indoctrination by atheists. Every culture, every society, seeks to instill its value into the minds of its children, and there's nothing wrong with that. Now, certain values may be wrong, but the practice of teaching children the values you were raised with is a perfectly reasonable and normal thing. What isn't normal is our kids' lives being completely controlled by the state. I'm getting off track here, but the point is that through education we seek to instill our values onto the next generation. We can also do this through culture and traditions. Think about a monument to a war hero. We immortalize this person with the hopes that it stands for centuries and that when people look at him and learn who he was, they recognize that he embodied virtues that have values such as self-sacrifice, honor, and nobility. Through family traditions, we seek to provide each generation with a way of connecting to their past and continuing the legacy of their ancestors. Again, the point of traditions and institutions under traditionalism is that they help provide a sense of permanence and sustainability and duty onto the successive generations in the hope that they will continue to uphold the moral truths. So this brings us to our final point: rejection of the idea that society can be built upon modern concepts. This will definitely get its own video, but I want to explain briefly what I mean by this. One of the reasons as to why traditionalists want to organize society in such a manner is that we believe these ideas are built to last. If I could describe in one word what attribute I think traditionalism holds most true, it would be sustainable. Traditional societies, based upon the idea of moral realism, which seek to have society abide by these moral truths, and which, through tradition, seek to preserve these moral truths, tend to be insanely stable. Looking at history and various traditional societies around the world, these societies can, in theory, last indefinitely, save for some extreme circumstances. This is in direct contrast with modernity, or the new set of values that the West has adopted over the past century. Traditionalists see forces like globalism, the sexual revolution, and multiculturalism as not only having a decidedly negative impact on humanity, but are ultimately destabilizing forces, and that the societies which abide by them are inherently unstable and not sustainable. The way I see it, whereas traditionalism not only preserves cultures and values, but inspires people to create new works of culture that values truth, modernity is completely destructive. From the French Revolution to the modern progressive left, it seems that all they can do is corrupt, destroy, mock, and criticize. So, to conclude, when I say that I'm a traditionalist, what that means is that I believe that morality is objective, I believe society ought to abide by those objective moral truths, society should strive to impart those moral truths down through the generations, and that modernity sucks. Diabana.
Wir wollen unseren alten Kaiser Wilhelm wieder. Wir wollen unseren alten Kaiser Wilhelm wieder. Aber den mit dem Bart, mit dem langen Bart. Aber den mit dem Bart, mit dem langen Bart. So schwärmten unsere Eltern von der guten alten Zeit. Sie liegt so fern und weit, die alte Kaiserzeit. Doch war sie wirklich besser, diese gute alte Zeit, als einst der Opa, die Oma hat wohl gefeit. Ja, mit Jagdgesang und mit Hörnerklang, rings um Fair Berlin, durch die Wälder ziehen. Ja, mit Jagdgesang und mit Hörnerklang, ritt die Oma mit dem Opa. Doch sie hielten an und küssten sich, sonst wären wir